Welcome to Show Me Sports Legacies. This is our 6th episode. I'm joined by Chris Hockenfels this evening. We're playing this drumbeat thing. It comes with the Tascam Mixcast 4, so, thousands of people have this equipment, and therefore they have this particular drumbeat. But, it's a stand-in right now as we seek to find that perfect piece of music that captures the essence of this podcast.
Right. I think every great podcast has a great intro, and our job is going to be over the next couple weeks and next couple episodes to dig deep and find one that our listeners will like, that we like. We'll go right along with what we're trying to do with the podcast. And it's out there, Jeff. I know it. We just have to find it and not have to pay too much in royalty money because our revenue stream at this point is limited, although big things are coming.
Absolutely. I haven't seen that revenue stream. It's quite a trickle. And it's kind of probably dried up the revenue stream, but that's okay. We're not doing it for that. Really launched some of this and I bought things on eBay, and you do what you got to do, right, to launch things. Found this melody.com, and they offered this great sale, and it was a deal for perpetuity. And so I've been going through some of these things. You say, I want anthemic music, or I want upbeat, or I want bouncy. So this is one that I pulled out of the hat and played for my daughter, made her put some headphones on. The piece I chose was And They're Off by Russell Thornton from the Melody Music Collection. I liked it. It was fun. And this is her feedback. Here's a good one. I think you're going to like it.
Are we at the Royal Palace?
Wait, it's going to come up big.
Oh, no. I just think of royal people in their big dresses, dancing around in a circle.
That describes our show. Okay. Has it gotten any better?
No. Still dancing around in a circle.
Just like they're running toward a huge...
Like a horse.
A feast.
No, like a big horse. They're playing... What's that one game? Is it... No, they're on the horses and they hit the thing with the... Take the thing and hit the ball. Oh, that. Their fancy little outfits while the other people are underneath tents drinking.
I love the way you describe that, though. They hit the thing with the ball. That describes every sport. Okay, that was not a sell. That was not a sell to the daughter on that one.
I think that that will go well with our jousting episode coming up here in a couple weeks. But I tend to agree that maybe not the...
Are there any jousters in Grundy County?
There probably was at one point, maybe even two, but then after the first jousting competition, there was only one remaining, it was over after that. One jousting match in the history of Grundy County, and then since there was only one left standing, then we have to move on to a different sport.
I'm with you on that. We want to be safe. Okay, so we'll keep looking.
I think drums are good. A little piano a la Billy Joel might be good, although maybe not from his collection. That might cost you a little bit. And I don't think Napster is what it used to be, where you could download illegally and just use them. The royalty police are out there and will catch you if you use music. I don't know how they do it, but it seems like within minutes they find you online if you use music, especially some groups. So keep searching, and we'll find something to kick off the podcast every week.
Okay, I'll keep looking. When you talk about how they find you, we're just starting. It's hard for people that want to find us to find us. It's amazing that they would find us, but they would, and then there would be a lawyer's letter shortly after that.
Right. That's where your name is on the top line and mine is somewhere on line 6 or 7. That's
I need to get that LLC worked out, that thing. Okay, that sounds good. Good advice, and we'll move forward with that, and maybe our listeners will chime in with some ideas about that. We are going to next, as we move into the main part of our program tonight, we have Joe Walljasper, former sports editor for a long time at the Columbia Daily Tribune, following all Mizzou sports and particularly football. We're going to talk some football and some stories about following Missouri sports. We are joined now by Joe Walljasper, former, Trenton resident, grew up in Trenton, Missouri. Went on to big things at the University of Missouri, J School. I was a long-time sports reporter and then sports editor for the Columbia Daily Tribune, covering all things Mizzou, and has gone on to some other adult activities after his time in the world of sports. But we're happy to have you with us, Joe.
All right. Well, thoughts and prayers to your number of clicks for this episode, but I'm happy to be here.
You know, content is important, and we had a lot of clicks on the last episode relative to what we had done before, and that just ramped it up. We're bringing you in, and I've read all the podcasting books, and they say most podcasts last exactly 6 episodes. You're in episode 6, so you're getting us over the hump.
This will be the end. I'm happy to be a part of the end of your podcast.
Thank you. Joe is a Trenton High School graduate in 1988. In 87, shared quarterback duties. Some in the 87 season, played men's tennis, American Legion baseball. You were involved in all the things that Trenton offers. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Trenton at that time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I when I grew up in Trenton, like especially as a little kid, there really wasn't a lot of youth sports available. There was Little League baseball, and I think they had wrestling for boys and maybe softball for girls, but that was about it. So a lot of my best sports memories were just playing football in the park with friends. Like I could probably still tell you the phone numbers of my best friends from childhood because we were just always on the phone organizing games at the park. And so that was almost every weekend, tackle football in the park with friends. That was living. So I lived in the lake area, and so that was a great place to grow up. You got bored on a spring day, you could walk down and go fishing, or summertime go swimming. And of course it was, the 70s and the early 80s, so just minimal parental supervision of all times. So it was kind of just a fun time to wander the streets of Trenton.
I understand that Craig Carpenter was involved in those activities.
Yeah, Craig Carpenter he lived close by, and he went on to far greater tennis glory than I did.
And I understand your dad might have been the quarterback for most of those activities.
He was sometimes he would play with us, and you had to touch him and tackle. We had to tackle each other, but touch him to get him down. So if it was an odd number of players, he would join in and even it out.
You attended the University of Missouri, graduated in 1992 with a journalism degree. Talk about, did you know that's what you were heading toward? Had that always kind of been on the radar for you to get into journalism?
Not necessarily. I think probably most kids, they probably would imagine being like the guy with the towel around his waist being asked questions and not the guy in the khaki pants asking the questions. So I was probably had imagined a different future, but at a certain point the reality kind of set in, and you sort of imagine what is more realistic. Growing up, my parents always, there was a lot of newspapers around. We got the Trenton paper and the Kansas City paper, and I remember on Sundays we would go to the Mart drugstore on Main Street and get the Des Moines Register because my parents were both from Iowa. So always a lot of newspapers around. I was a big Chiefs fan from age 5 on. So I think my introduction to it was I would like to read stories about the Chiefs in the Kansas City paper. So that probably got me into it. And then in high school, I had an English teacher who was kind of supportive of my weirder efforts at writing stories. Her name was Mrs. Siebenborn, and I remember, I wrote some fan fiction about my junior high shop teacher, Ray Barrows, Swede, the sign painter, who, I don't know if you guys remember him, but he would wear the barrel and walk in the parades. She kind of got a kick out of those and sort of maybe motivated me to think that I could write a little bit. And then I went to junior college for 1 year. I guess it had just changed names to North Central Missouri College at that point. I don't know. I figured that nobody had a better idea, so I thought I would give journalism a shot.
You weren't just a journalist. Obviously, you were a student, you were a fan, you were all these things. And one of the things that you mentioned to me in our communication before today is how you kind of lived through your University of Missouri football experience and other sports experience as a fan and suffered with the rest of us when some of these things happened. So talk about what you called the unholy trinity of Mizzou athletic disasters.
Yeah, so I got to Mizzou, I guess it would have been in 89. So basically it was most of my time there, as a student, and then early as my reporting career was in the 90s, which was kind of at least in the football sense, it was kind of the tail end of this awful losing streak. I think they end up have losing seasons for maybe 14 years in a row, something like that. So when I was a student, I remember we went as fans to the Colorado game in 1990. And it was Colorado, I think, was ranked first, or they were up there. there were so few people that would go to the games back then. There's like 30,000 people. So as you know, Missouri somehow has the lead in this game against all odds. And as Colorado's driving down the field in the final seconds, you're able to just kind of walk along down the stands with them. So you're always like had a spot right on the line of scrimmage. And they finally got to the end zone. We'd had a few cocktails before, and so we were not even aware there was a fifth down. We just thought they didn't get in on their last play, which they probably didn't. And so we stormed the field thinking Missouri had won, and then it was like we finally realized, oh, wait a minute, they didn't. So that was kind of the introduction, really, of the terrible things that can happen to you when you sort of invest in Missouri athletics. Then as a beat writer, my first, I guess, sort of job at the Tribune was as a basketball beat writer. So this would have been the 1994-95 season. I was there courtside when Missouri has a 1-point lead on UCLA in the second round. UCLA, the number 1 seed, went on to win the whole tournament, and then 4.8 seconds left. Tyus Edney goes to the length of the court, scores to knock Missouri out of that game. Then 2 years after that, I was at the game as the football beat writer when they play Missouri is against number 1 Nebraska on their way to a national title. Missouri has somehow got the lead. Final seconds, basically has to defend one more play, and the ball gets knocked out of, I guess it was Shevin Wiggins' hands. He kicks it over his head. Matt Davison makes a diving catch, and Missouri loses in overtime. So those really were the three games that convinced all Missouri fans that this was truly a cursed athletic program.
Chris, you were at that game as well, but you were rooting for the other side, I think.
Yeah, I have the opposite perspective as a Mizzou fan. Joe, one of your classmates, Tim Key, is the one responsible to get me into watching Nebraska football when I moved here in 1991 or 1992. He had said, you need a team to follow. I followed Nebraska. Okay, I did not knowing that everybody else in town followed Mizzou at the time. And we went to some Nebraska games and became a fan and went to probably all but 2 Nebraska Mizzou games from about 94 to 2004. Was at that game, sat in a Missouri section, got some tickets, sat next to Missouri fans, and it was quite the experience seeing it from the other end. Although I know Mizzou fans have had their share, but just let time take care of things. When I came on the scene, Nebraska was ruling the world in the 90s and Missouri was down, and you thought it would never change. And here we are. I'm, as a Nebraska fan, just begging to have a good season, and Mizzou's on top of the world in the SEC, winning big bowl games, winning 10, 11 games. So sports, usually, if you just give it time, it's like a roller coaster. You'll go up and you'll come back down. Sometimes it's a longer wait for others, but Mizzou's definitely got something good going in football right now.
My daughter, we took her to meet all of her great uncles and aunt when she was just a few months old. And Nebraska is kicking off their football season, and one of the uncles, Harris, lives in Omaha, huge Cornhusker fan. He's got himself wired in to listen to the game, and my daughter is literally 5 months old, and he starts to head over to her with the earbuds, and my wife says, get away from her, she's going to be a Mizzou fan. And he goes, get ready for a lifetime of disappointment, And I couldn't really argue with him at that point. No. Now I wouldn't want to have the plight of the Nebraska fan trying to regain their glory. How about, I'm not going to ask you to admit that you ever sat with the Antlers or were an Antler or anything like that, but I know that they crossed your path as a sports reporter and kind of a mixed bag of things about the Antlers. What's unique about the Antlers, and what's good and what's the downside of that?
I do remember going to parties at the Antlers they had like a little faux fraternity called the Pies, and we would go to their house for parties sometimes. I think they were in their heyday, and they were clever. It was sort of like the plight of the media and the Antlers sort of had a similar fate, because in the beginning, the media was down on press row and the Antlers were right behind us. And then we were both slowly kind of made our way out of the prime seats as we all fell out of favor at about the same time.
Nolan Richardson claimed that the Antlers helped him to victory one year. I I remember reading about that.
Yeah, I think they greeted their bus outside the Hearn Center with like a hog's head on a stick. And they were kind of famous for like, they would figure out when the opposing team bus was coming into town and would surround it with their vehicles and slow down to about 10 miles an hour and do whatever they could to interrupt sleep patterns and whatnot.
You talked about the drought that Missouri was in, but when Larry Smith arrived, things changed a little for Missouri, at least when Corby got into the games. It took us to a couple years of some level of relevancy. Was that kind of in the first part of your career in covering football?
Yeah, I covered as a beat writer in 1996 and 97. So honestly, that was the most fun I ever had covering a team. Larry was kind of like a paternal figure, but he was just a real human. He would have been like a terrible poker player. You knew exactly what he was thinking at all times. And sometimes he'd get mad at you, but then the next day he would have, it was all forgiven and forgotten. And he was really incredibly open. And so you really got to know the players. If you wanted to go out and watch practice, you could go out and watch practice. You want to talk to somebody after the game, you grabbed them and talked to them. And so you really got to know the players. And a lot of them were Missouri kids. And so I felt kind of a bond with that team because I think 1997, when they finally broke that drought, I think 10 of 11 starters were from Missouri. The whole offense, 3/5 of the offensive line was basically from Brookfield. I mean, it was really maybe the last Missouri football team that was really a Missouri football team. And it was a lot of fun. Brock Olivo, they had some characters like that. Ron James, the fullback, a lot of fun to cover. I just have a lot of great memories about that time. And it's hard for people to understand now how far away it seemed to even make a mediocre bowl game was back then. It just seemed like it was never going to happen. 1997 was a close game against Nebraska, but the vast majority, it was 66-0. And there was always the thought that the Nebraska fans were so nice. And I think if you're beating somebody that bad, of course, you have no reason to be mean to people if they're coming into your stadium and losing like that. So there was a lot of that. I think back in that time too, he was sort of you always kind of hired the opposite of what came before you. And I think before him, it was Bob Stull who was throwing the ball all over the place. And so they brought in Larry Smith and it was like, I'm going to tear up the artificial turf, the Omni turf. I'm going to, we're going to basically try to become Nebraska Junior here in terms of running the ball, running the option. And they happened to get a quarterback, fortunately enough, who was from Columbia and his dad was on staff. So that helped. But I think Missouri and Nebraska were the two teams that were kind of vying for him. And I would maintain that if Corby Jones had gone to Nebraska, it might have been him instead of Scott Frost leading Nebraska to the 1997 title, because I think he was that good. He was kind of carrying those Missouri teams in those days.
I recall that. The thing I remember about Larry Smith was, you remember the rubber bands he made the guys wear around? He always had some motivational technique, kind of old school.
Yeah, he was very old school. It was kind of corny. It was always bounce back week or snap back week or stuff like that. But I really liked him. I don't think he ever quite mastered my name, but he kind of had that grandfatherly, you couldn't help but like him.
Eventually didn't replace Corby with the strong enough quarterback and didn't have, all the pieces he needed and kind of fell on hard times for a couple of years. Gary Pinkel was hired. Tell us about the beginnings of that Gary Pinkel era. It didn't just take hold right away. A lot of people have a memory like it just all happened when he showed up.
Yeah.
It was a struggle.
It really was. I think he came in and he believed that what he was doing would work. And he brought an entire staff from Toledo, basically hired, the only person he retained was Andy Hill from Missouri. He was convinced that kind of what he learned from Don James would work here. But I think as with any coach, unless you find the quarterback and then the quarterback to replace the quarterback and the guy to replace that guy, you're never going to sustain success. They were smart enough to see a diamond in the rough in Brad Smith. And it took a few years because I think around Brad Smith, there was pretty much next to nothing for those first few years. So it took a minute. And there was really nothing about the way he was building a program that would lead you to believe it would be quick, because it really wasn't like star-studded recruiting classes. It wasn't going to be an instant turnaround. But when you have a quarterback as dynamic as him, if you can put a halfway decent team around him, that was kind of the start of the whole thing.
On that third year, they had a good year, went to the Independence Bowl, and then they fell back, didn't qualify for a bowl that next year. And there are several things I'm interested in. One is there was a tragedy that summer between those two seasons with Aaron O'Neill passing away after a voluntary practice workout in July of 95. And Coach Pinkel was gone on vacation and came back to try to figure out how you move forward from that. And you had to write about that. Talk about that. That had to be such a not only a horrible event, a tragedy, but just the opposite of what writing about football is generally like.
Yeah, and the kind of the awful thing about that was you kind of knew and liked and respected the people who were kind of supervising the workout, and so nobody wanted this to happen. Maybe mistakes were made, but nobody wanted this to happen. And so yeah, it was just awful. I don't know what else you can say. It was just awful. So, and it wasn't really, it was just seemed almost so flukish. I think it was an 85-degree day, which for a summer workout was nothing. He was struggling that day, and people didn't recognize it as the dire situation it was, and just let it go on too long before he got help. And so I think the players that at least afterward would tell you that they did see, before then, I think Pinkel was kind of believed in a more old school where you're kind of standoffish with you're the CEO and you're a little standoffish with your players, and they would respect you as you weren't supposed to be their friend kind of. They would tell you he did maybe change a little after that and let his guard down a little bit and become a little more vulnerable with them. How much difference that makes in winning or losing, it's always, talent is the ultimate divider there. But you could say though that in a season like that one where there were a couple inflection points, that 2005 season where they could have gone the other way. I mean, they had to win in overtime, I think, against Middle Tennessee State or something like that. Brad Smith got knocked out of a game against Iowa State that they needed to win. I mean, they needed every one of those regular season wins to even make a bowl game. And then in one of my many trips to Shreveport, in the Independence Bowl, they were down, I think, 21-0 to South Carolina in the first half and come back win. So you did see a little resiliency in the team, and who knows if team spirit and camaraderie can play a role in that.
It almost seemed like that comeback with Marcus King's interception, down 21-0, and South Carolina going in to go up 28-0. That had turned into one of those horrible Larry Smith blowouts at K-State kind of games. Mm-hmm. Would Pinkel have suffered the consequences of that? The difference between winning and losing and success and failure is pretty slim, as we Chiefs fans know.
That's right.
a kicker.
Now that with the Chiefs, you're falling backwards into Super Bowl titles and supposedly disappointing years. It's kind of, you realize that you've experienced the other side of that. But yeah, that season probably was a pretty good turning point. It was a couple years beyond that before they really started winning big. But if not for that, you don't know how history changes.
Then the SEC comes in the picture. Not too long after that. I mean, we have success in the Big 12 and win the North. Go to bowl games, have the Chase Daniel era, and follow up with quarterbacks, Blaine Gabbert and different folks that are quality quarterback. And then the SEC comes to town. That whole thing, how much of that did you cover from the business side or the alliance side? Or how hard was it to get information about what was happening at that point?
Yeah, there was a lot of false starts. I think in the beginning it seemed like Missouri was going to go to the Big Ten, then Nebraska turned out to be the more popular choice there. And so it was, and then, so it would go from Missouri kind of feeling like it was the belle of the ball, and then suddenly having to kind of go back and grovel back to the Big 12 and say, sorry, we didn't mean it. And then, there's a lot of fell in and out of favor with the Big 12. And I don't know, I guess if I could freeze a moment in time, I probably would have preferred to freeze the way the Big 8. It's a regional conference that you can drive basically to anywhere but Colorado from Missouri. Most of these schools you can drive there. They're teams you played forever. 8's a great number. I think when and I think I wrote this at the time, is like you can look at it for what you wish it were, or you can look at it from the reality of it, which is it's a business. And if this conference is going to probably get picked apart, whether you're taking the high ground or the first train out of town. So it's probably smart from a business perspective to go when you get a chance to a league that's not gonna. So you can all further reconfigurations, you can kind of sit off to the side and watch them happen. So it made sense that they did it from a business perspective. I can't say that I like college athletics more now that it's these conferences that span the country, or every rivalry is just from 3 weeks ago. I mean, I think if you ask Missouri or Arkansas fans if they're really rivals, you like to beat the other team, but it's not. The real measure of a rivalry is how much pleasure you take in the misfortune of the others, I still think. And so Arkansas can lose a game and nobody notices in Missouri, but if Kansas loses the game, they still notice. So that part of it, I think, has been lost, and it's kind of a bummer to me. I think for younger people, it's probably no big deal, but I was kind of old enough to kind of get in on it when they were still the Big Eight, and that was kind of my favorite era.
I think if you asked 100 sports fans across the country if we could snap our fingers and go back to, say, the year 2000 before conference realignment, I think the majority of them would snap their fingers and go back. I think it's, a money thing, and it's been great for TV and all those revenue streams coming in. But the fact that when you look in the paper and the standings and your conference, where your teams in the Midwest has teams from New Jersey and California in the same conference, you wonder what happened. So I agree with you. I love the Big Eight. I love getting up and driving to a game that only took 4 or 5 hours. You could do it in a Saturday. It was a lot of fun. Big 12 was fun too. Now sometimes I turn a game on, I wonder, oh my gosh, what conference are they in? Which is crazy to think, but how far we've come in about 20 years of conference realignment. Funny thing too, Trenton High School was kind of following along this conference realignment scenario too, when they were trying to get into a conference, posturing back and forth and kind of experience some of the same things you were talking about, Joe, with sometimes you think conferences want you, and then all of a sudden they don't, and it's back to the drawing board. And eventually Trenton wound up in a conference, and that conference has now changed 3 times since Trenton joined 10 years ago. So it's been kind of crazy.
Yeah, the thing about at the college level, you're making a lot more revenue from TV, but to a fan, who cares? I mean, what does that do for us? Every team in the conference is making that much money. It isn't really an advantage. It's maybe an advantage over teams from group of 5 leagues. So I don't know that, I think sometimes the fans got caught up in the competition of realignment and like, ooh, we're wanted. That's exciting. Now we're in this other conference, but is your experience better? I mean, do you enjoy basketball season when South Carolina and Mississippi State come here compared to Iowa State or Kansas? I don't personally. That part, I think, maybe great. They're making $50 million in TV revenue instead of 18 or whatever it was, but who cares?
I'm happy that at least Tennessee has taken on the villain role. I don't know if it's a rivalry, but the villain role does add a little juice to it, makes it a little more fun. And we finally got some comeuppance for them last year. So, we broke through after kind of slogging around since the 2015 season. Is this sustainable, what we're seeing with Missouri? What do people think coming into this season? Is everyone excited, or is it kind of each season is its own thing?
This season, people are extremely excited. I think it's in terms of the long-term thing, it kind of goes back to what we said before. Can you keep finding the next quarterback? For as complicated as football is, as you look back in time, it's you can sort of pick out the good seasons with, oh yeah, that was the year Chase Daniel was here. Oh, that was the year when Blaine Gabbert was pretty good. And so the years when Matty Monk was going off the rails, those were the bad years. The years where Connor Bazelak was the quarterback, those are the bad years. So that's the challenge for Drinkwitz. I think the positives I've seen from him was, when he arrived, I think everybody thought that this guy is offensive genius. He's a quarterback whisperer. Really, neither one of those things turned out to be true. The first 3 years, the quarterbacks were bad and didn't develop. The offense was really turning around and handing it off to Larry Roundtree or Tyler Beatty 40 times a game. But I think where he succeeded was, number one, he did recruit well. He did a good job of selling the program. And number two, he was smart enough to realize, maybe I'm not able to do all of this at once. Maybe I can't be a good offensive coordinator and a head coach. Hired a good offensive coordinator who has helped Brady Cook develop. So that's the positive. I mean, being at least having the self-awareness to realize what your weaknesses are and what your strengths are. So he has recruited really well. And I think the key is you got to be able to find the next quarterback. Brady Cook, let's face it, he kind of lucked into him. He didn't recruit him, and he tried to replace him for 3 years. He is developed, but you still got to find the next one. And that guy probably isn't on the roster now. So that's the key moving forward. This is going to be Brady Cook's last year. So if it's going to keep rolling, you got to find the next one.
Speaking of quarterbacks on the field after the Chiefs won their Super Bowl before the last one, I remember Paul Rudd's son is out there in the confetti, and he says, I can't believe I live in the era when Patrick Mahomes is our quarterback. I mean, sometimes it just falls into your lap, or you get lucky and you have the guy. And and like you say, Brady Cook Drinkwitz defended him, but he was on thin ice, with Sam Horn and everybody clamoring for Sam Horn to play more. So it kind of fell into that.
This era especially, not many guys stick around when it's clear that they're not that wanted. And he was a guy who always wanted to play for Mizzou, and he did. God bless him for that. But that's you got a little lucky on that one, I'd say.
Now, there's a hot story lately with Deion Sanders out in Colorado, and the feud with the press release where Sean Keeler from the Denver Post has been persona non grata. They're not going to talk to him. And that's been talked about on the talk shows a lot lately. Tell me, coaches notoriously want control, and if you write anything that's not glowing, some of them get a little thin-skinned about that. Perhaps, what were your experiences with that?
Well, my first, when I was a student reporter at the Columbia Missourian, the first major beat I had was covering Mizzou basketball. This was Norm Stewart, early 90s era Norm Stewart. So that was, he wasn't Bob Knight, but he wasn't far off it. It was terrifying. I kind of joke around that maybe the best journalism teacher I ever had was Norm Stewart, because you didn't just sort of extemporaneously throw out a question to him as a student reporter. You workshopped it and repeated it to yourself 50 times and try to find every crack in the potential that he was going to find in that. So I kind of grew up in an era where it was not so much a interrogation of a coach. There was some back and forth. So I think that's fine. I always felt like if you're going to be a columnist or a commentator who criticizes people, it's fair game to get a little bit back. Now, I am not familiar enough with Sean Keeler's game to know if he's truly out to get the University of Colorado or not. I suspect not. But I think, a little back and forth with the coach, and it's good content for everyone. Now, if I were the coach, I think probably the smarter approach is, if a guy like that is truly biased against you or out to get you, when you go on a rant like that, you're really giving him exactly what he wants. Honestly, if you feel like someone is asking you a question who's got an agenda, I would probably try to kill him with blandness and politely answer the question as blandly as I could. And then the next person who asks a question, give a great, engaging answer full of funny anecdotes. And it becomes pretty clear what your real feelings are without, becoming a national story.
That sounds like a good approach, but I don't think that's Deion's approach.
No, and I think he's probably, even though he's been so in the public eye and is well aware of how media and the sports work, even last year after their first win, he was sort of like calling people out, like, you didn't believe it. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding or not wanting to understand that the role is not to be a cheerleader. It's to be fair, and doing something like predicting who's going to win the game. You might predict your team one time and then the other team the next. It doesn't mean you have an agenda. So I think he has kind of thought that you're with us or against us with the media, which probably should not be the case.
I saw Billy Napier talking after their most recent debacle with Miami, and he was talking about people in basements in Florida, which somebody pointed out there are no basements in Florida, on social media, and that his players should just ignore all that. And that, I go, that's the first step toward walking the plank, as a coach, when you start calling out your fan base.
There's nothing you can say when things are going as bad as they are for him right now that's going to win people over. So keep it short, keep it pleasant, and let's just get on and try to win a game. There truly is, no matter what you say, if you're on top of the world and you're Bill Belichick, you can be as rude as you want. But if you're 0-1 after getting crushed by Miami, just move on.
Well, I was going to say, and Deion Sanders brings a different element into the equation, because he's been under the brightest lights and he has been an athlete, and he has, I guess, no qualms about telling it how it is, because he knows he's got a fan base and a social media base behind him. And fair or not, when you ask Deion questions, they better be worded to the extent where he can answer them without upsetting him, because he is not going to take it right or wrong. And I'm not the biggest Deion fan, especially this week, but I don't think that he means to do it. But if you get someone like Deion Sanders engaged in these kind of things, you're probably going to lose because of who he is and the following that he has.
You're going to, as a media person, you are going to lose depending on the record of the coach. Like when Pinkel first got to Mizzou, he was pretty harsh. Like he wanted you to be on board. He didn't like questions that questioned him. And so if you were someone who did, the fans would take his side. In 2004, when he was on his way to his third losing season in his first four, then they were on your side. It's just all about their record. It's the same deal with covering Norm Stewart in the 90s. He was tough, but the fans thought he was a lovable curmudgeon. Then had a few losing seasons, and then he was outdated. So it's all related to the record.
I want to just ask you, as you've stepped away from the mega business of college sports, you covered other things, probably things that were a little less stressful and more fun, and some oddball stories. And you brought one up to us that just touched all the touch points that I really enjoyed. So talk us through that, or any other kind of fun things that you got to do, sidebar stories that turned out to be some of the most fun things you ever did.
Yeah, I always kind of enjoyed. There's like a subcategory of oddballs that just crave publicity, and those are the people I really like to seek out, because they were so eager to please and they were so odd. And so, like, the story I sent you was I guess it was in 2008. There's a Elvis impersonator in Columbia, Elvis impersonator / magician, Mario Manzini. And so he had organized, had a show he was trying to promote in a few nights. And so he was going to escape from 13 handcuffs in the Super 8 hotel pool. And so he invited all the media out, and I was the only one who showed up. And so I had a great time, helped him get the handcuffs on, and detailed his death-defying dip into the 5-foot deep pool. He made it out in, I think, just under 30 seconds or so. So I can vouch for his Houdini-like skills. So that was a fun one. There was a guy who would call all the time, who he had a catfish fishing lake, and he was always trying to get more people to come out, and it was like a pay-as-you-go fishing lake. And so he had it was called Christian Fishing Lakes, and he had banned cussing or smoking or drinking at his fishing lake. And so he told me about this big grand opening. So I went out there, and he spent a lot of time. He was trying to use the article basically to get his wife had left him, to get her to come back. And he was trying to display to her how he would change. So I wrote all about how he's having the grand opening. Of course, nobody had showed up to the grand opening. So he called me back 2 days later and told me he'd done a 180, and it was now a clothing optional fishing lake. So I just appreciated the willingness, the flexibility of the man if you're in business and it's not working, you got to pivot. And I can tell you, the weeds of this place were so high. As a closing optional lake, I mean, the ticks would have been unbelievable. So that was a fun one for sure.
There are some things that are uniquely Missouri kind of stories, and that seems to fit right there as one. Hey, we've got an opportunity, and certainly want to have you back at some point if you're willing to talk to us. And if we make it past our 6th episode,
I was going to say, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You got to get to episode 7 first.
Definitely in basketball, there's a lot of Missouri basketball dysfunctionality that has happened over your career. And I was thinking about, being a Missouri fan, and back in the day with the Chiefs, I recall when Nick Lowry had a mutiny at his house, and John Makovic got fired because our kicker had a meeting at his house. And I thought, well, how bad a pro team do you have to be when your kicker is leading a mutiny and people actually follow? And then we had the bad kickers, the Lynn Elliott's of the world and all that kind of stuff. So it was a struggle. And my wife used to say, I want to root for a different team. Who could I root for? And she tried Florida for a couple of weeks. That didn't work for her. And then finally the Oregon Ducks seemed to be the thing that, nobody was mad at her for being an Oregon Ducks fan. It's just a part of a lifestyle, I guess is what I'm getting at. People go, why would you root for this team? Well, I don't really have a choice in that. I was raised with people that would come to church on Sunday, and they had been to the game in Columbia, and I just was a kid, and I just desperate for information. How was it? How big was the crowd? What did you see? And just grew up with that your whole life, and you just can't change your stripes.
No, and I think a lot of it too is like, you sort of remember who you were with when you watch these disasters, and decades down the line, it becomes it doesn't really even matter who won the game. It was like, oh, I remember that day I was with this friend or this family member when Lynn Elliott missed all those kicks. It is more fun in the moment, obviously, when Patrick Mahomes falls backwards into 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. I'm not saying that, but I think it's sort of an excuse to get together with family and friends and reconnect with people. I have friends from high school that were texting all the time during Chiefs game. And, especially as men, we sort of need excuses to connect with old friends and family. So this sports is the conduit to that, I think.
Well, Joe, I just want to thank you for being willing to join us. Enjoyed the talk, and I'll put it out later this week. And so episode 6 will be sent at that point.
And if this is indeed the end, I hope you guys had a good run. I
want to thank Joe Walljasper for joining us with some great stories of his time covering sports journalism in the mid-Missouri area and the Missouri Tigers. Now, he talked about, kind of fondly talked about the old Big 8 days and those rivalries. And Chris, what's your favorite rivalry of all time?
Well, moving to Trenton in 1992, 93, I caught the tail end of what was the Trenton-Chillicothe football rivalry for many years, going back to when my wife's father played football, and that stretch from the 1960s through the early 2000s, late 90s. Seen some response from our last podcast about Trenton football. The rivalry came up, and so shout out to the 1995 team that went to Chillicothe and won in that rivalry, because those players remember that. I remember that was the year before I got here to Trenton. And I remember the story about the bus taking the back way to Chillicothe because they were going to do it different and not drive down Highway 65. And then the stories from the people in Trenton that are our age or a little older about what that rivalry meant, about playing on Veterans Day or Armistice Day every year. It didn't matter what day of the week it was. I've heard stories about that. If that was on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, that was the day that you played Chillicothe at the end of the year in November. And then, as time tends to do in sports, that rivalry is all but washed away and only memories are out there about the Sugar Bucket. All the stories about the 1990 game and the 1966 game with the thousands of people in attendance at Old CF Russell Stadium. So that one comes to mind. Of course, for college, for someone like me, the Nebraska-Oklahoma rivalry was fierce. I loved the Kansas-Mizzou rivalry. I always think of that one a little more in basketball, but I know they had some fierce rivalries in football as well. But I like the fact that Joe brought up that the key to any good rivalry is not when you win as much as when your rival loses, so you can take some enjoyment in their suffering. So those are some ones I think of, rivalries. And the Chiefs, Broncos, or even the Chiefs Raiders, if we're getting to the NFL, those have been some great rivalries over the years, old AFL, AFC rivalries. So some good stuff. What about you?
I think the Chiefs Raiders goes right to the top for me. I mean, I really latched onto that during the Lenny Dawson era, but then again with Marty just dominating the Raiders. And it was Raiders week, and it was all you heard, and I just loved it. And the way he would motivate his team, and whatever stuck in his craw or made him hate the Raiders or want to beat them, he did it. I mean, he just dominated them. I grew up in Lawson. Lawson-Lathrop is a huge rivalry and always was. Really got after each other. And on the college side, I think you're right. Nebraska-Oklahoma.
Yeah, a lot of people are really into their fandom, and nothing brings out your fandom like a rivalry. You see the polls sometimes. What's the greatest? Duke, North Carolina. How can you beat that in college basketball, those rivalries? So it's a great thing in sports to have a rival, because even when you are having a losing season or not quite going to make the playoffs, when it's rivalry week, it's something different. And maybe that win's going to spur you on to greatness the next season if you could just beat your rival or upset them on their way to a great season. And now I'll probably lose some fans for this, but become quite a football, as in soccer, fan over the last few years. My son and I went over to England to watch a game, a Manchester City game. The biggest roar in the crowd came when they flashed the Manchester United score from that day up on the board. And of course, if you know anything about English football, they have chants, they chant, and they sing all game, different over here. And all the fans from one team sit in one section and not allowed to sit in the home section. So the home fans, when they see the United score come up on the scoreboard, if they lose, they sing a chant, and it's usually the loudest chant of the day, because that's their natural rival. They're in the same town. So yeah, you love to see your rival lose. Cheer when they do.
See them suffer a little bit. Okay, so we're winding up this episode. We want to thank Joe Walljasper for joining us. We are very happy with the response to our last episode with Wes Croy. Had a lot of new fans. Hope that you'll enjoy the things we put out, and we'll continue having fun with this, and hope that you'll enjoy it as well.
Things that I never thought I would say, but now that I do, like, subscribe, and share, and tell all your friends. We want to spread the word and let people enjoy the podcast and really enjoy doing it. And Jeff, I really enjoy coming and being a part of it. So thank you.
Well, thank you for listening to Show Me Sports Legacies.